Well, hey, everybody, and good morning to you, and welcome again to our Sunday morning online service. And I want to welcome you if you are regular at our church, and if you are just watching online and you've been following us, we're glad you're here as well. Just let me, before we get going, if you didn't get the email or haven't looked at your email that came out on Friday evening, you want to go ahead and do that because there's good news in there, and that is that next week we will begin having in-person, live, physical gatherings on a Sunday morning. New location and some changes will be going on with that. You'll want to go back, find that email that came out Friday night, and grab a hold of that, and you'll see all the details that you need. Probably the biggest detail that you need to know about right now is that in order to attend the service on Sunday, you have to RSVP first. All right, so that'll go live on Monday night. The details, again, are in the Harvest Happenings email, but you want to grab a hold of that so we can know, because of capacity limitations, who all is coming and how we can prepare for that. So the good news for me right now is that means that this is the last Sunday that I will be looking directly into a camera with really hardly anybody else in the room, and I am looking forward so much to getting away from that. But I've been reminded, and I hope you have too, that the form of our time together, that can change. The church is always adapted to whatever the things are happening in culture, in the land, to allow God's word to continue to go forth. And so we adapt, but the mission stays the same. That is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. That's why we exist as a church. That's why the church as a whole exists, and that's why we're here and to get after that. And so we're going to do that this morning, and we know that God uses His word in the process of making that happen. So why don't you do this? Would you grab your Bibles and turn with me to 1 Peter chapter number 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, the title of today's message is Real Thinking. And while you're finding your way there, just telling you a little bit of a story. 1 Peter chapter 4. Back in the early 2000s, my family and I, we were living in Southern California. I was going to seminary, and every year we would take a trip to go see our family back in Florida. So we'd pick our family up, we'd fly from California to Florida, make this huge, great journey. And it was pretty easy in the early days. The early days, it was just me, Lori, and Bailey, so we could make that happen. And it was not too much struggle. It was difficult. That's a long flight, but just three of us, we can do that. But as we finished up, and by the time I graduated seminary, our family size had increased, and now we got to the size of 5. And something happens when you get to 5. Like when you get to 5, you're outnumbered as mom and dad. There's more kids than there are parents, and they realize that, and so they take advantage of that. And so it became increasingly difficult. And now we're taking this massive journey was even more difficult. Now we're taking the journey, and we're flying from California to Florida, this massive amount of time in an airplane, a confined space. And we're going, and all of our kids now are that time are under the age of 6, and so now we're flying them together. There's the layovers that you have on the way there. There's layovers on the way back. That means you got to take everything out of the plane, sit in the terminal, and bring it all back into the plane, put it back in the compartment, sit down, and do the whole thing over again for multiple hours with 3 kids under the age of 6, and you're traveling. That's at Christmas. So that is the busiest, most stressful traveling season of the year. People aren't nice. They aren't great. They're wanting to get to where they're going. And so all that combined, like this was for us an annual Armageddon for us. Like every single year, I still have flashbacks to that, to what happened with that. And Lori and I, we can get anxious even considering doing that again. And so you know what we had to do? So what we had to do around the beginning of December, we had to start getting our minds wrapped around what was going to take place in a couple of weeks. Like if we waited until December 25th, that was a bad plan. We had to go ahead and start preparing our minds in the beginning, put the war paint on, tie the bandana on, get ready for battle, because it was coming really, really soon. And one of the things that we did is we had some talking points that we always reminded each other of. So we came up with some of these. The number one most important one was this, is that no matter what happens in this flight, no matter what takes place, we can't turn on one another. All right, so no matter what the kids do, they're going to try to divide and conquer us, but we're not going to allow it. We're sticking together, because kids, man, if they see blood in the water, like they're on it, man. You're dead. And we knew that if we don't stick together, then this is over. It's going to get worse, not better. So we have to remain. We can't get at each other. We can't turn. We can't fight. We have to remain. We have to stay strong together. The second thing we would say is we have to be flexible. We got to be flexible. We know the stroller is not going to fit in the metal detector at some point. The kids are going to start crying. They're going to make messes. They're going to say things that are going to embarrass us. They're going to have people in the plane that are going to make faces at us. And we know we just got to keep going. And if you get tired, hand the baby off to me. If I get tired, I hand the baby off to you. But we have to be flexible, and we can't let them get to us. We have to push forward. Now, you may laugh at that, and it's meant to be humorous. But if we didn't get that thinking in our heads ahead of time, and we waited till the difficulty actually arrived, there was no way we were possibly going to survive that of every single year. Well, Peter in chapter 4 is functioning a lot like that. He's been talking a lot about suffering. Have you noticed? Talking a lot about suffering, and he's getting our minds prepared with that. This has been a theme throughout, and he's been looking at different ways how the suffering is a way that we can proclaim the gospel. And last week it was Jesus, how he suffered, and he's our great example. We can look over to him, and he's doing it, all these things to prepare our minds so that when suffering comes, we know how to handle that. We don't wait until it happens. But we can prepare, we can think about it rightly and have a right perspective about it, so when it comes, we're not blindsided and we actually accomplish the mission. When we take the plane ride of suffering, we know how to handle that and think about that. And I just love Peter that he understands there's a challenge with suffering. It's difficult, and he's not just giving you one verse or two verses and say, here you go, and see you later. He's like, no, I'm going to talk about this multiple times for you because I know it's real. Christians are going to suffer. You're going to suffer. I'm going to suffer. And whether we're experiencing it right now, or we know we can anticipate it's going to happen, like that, those are challenging thoughts, either one of those. It happens right now, or it may happen in the future. And many of you have been thinking about that. You've been forced to think about, well, what if I speak up for Jesus Christ at my workplace? Like, what if I talk about Jesus Christ there? There's a potential to lose my job, or the alienation that might come there. You might think to yourself, if I speak up about Christ and I declare the hope that I have, as Peter's been talking about, with my family or my friends or my neighborhoods, that relationships could be lost, and you have to think, am I prepared to suffer like that? I think Peter's forcing to think that. Have I wrapped my mind around that? Am I ready for that? I read a story this week about a teacher who was kind of wrestling with these things. He was growing in his walk with Jesus, and he was growing. He was learning in some of the things like Peter's mentioning here, that he was to be a gospel witness where he was, and that was grabbing a hold of his heart, and he was getting prepared. He didn't know he was getting prepared, but God was preparing him for a moment in time that was going to test whether or not he really thought about suffering the right way. He writes in this book that I was reading that he's a teacher at a public school, and there was a young gal in his class that for most of the entire school year, she was like one of his favorite students. Just had a wonderful demeanor, cheerful face, joyful person, but then for about 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe some months, you begin to notice a change in her. And she was no longer the person that she used to be. And her demeanor and her countenance had fallen. She was more defiant towards him. The way she interacted with the other students was different as well. And so he's watching. Finally, he says, I gotta say something. So he asked the young girl to hang out after class, and he says, man, this is how you used to be, and this is how you are now, and like, what is going on, and how can I help? And the young gal, she began to tear up, and she began to cry. And she began to describe her home life to this teacher, and how her dad had become an alcoholic, and he was drinking all over the place, and so that was making her home life just a traumatic place to be. Her parents had fallen into the party scene, and they were going out all hours of the night, partying. They're away from the home and leaving her to care for her siblings, and here she is, just a middle schooler. She has some other things that she alluded to that I'm not going to go into detail now that was happening, that was making life incredibly difficult for her. And so there was this moment that was there. Here, this teacher on a school property has this gal sharing this with her, and he thinks to himself, what am I supposed to do? And he says, I know it was against protocol, but I had to share something. And I began to tell her about the God who made her. I began to tell her about the God who loved her. I began to tell her about the God who had a plan for her life. And I prayed with her, and I invited her to youth group on Wednesday night, and we left and we went home. And all the while I was home that night, I was wrestling inside of me. I knew that I had crossed a line, across a boundary. I was wrestling. I couldn't sleep. And so the next morning he gets up and he goes right into school. He drives. He goes right into the principal's office. He's going to tell him everything that happened. Before we can get the words out, the principal already knew what happened. The mom had called of this young gal. She's angry. She's complaining. And the principal reprimanded the teacher for what he had done. And the teacher responds to their principal. He says, do you know about the girl's home life? Do you know what's taking place? And he says, yes, I do. And he says, well, you tell me, what good is it for her right now to know about Christopher Columbus, given what she's facing right now? Like, what good is that for her right now? See, that was a man that he was being prepared for suffering. He understood God was working in his life, and when the moment came, his thinking was right. He had come to a personal conviction that I have to be thinking. I have a greater purpose. I have to declare the gospel when God gives an opportunity for me, and he was ready for suffering. He had a conviction. He had a higher purpose for his life. He had prepared his mind. And Peter, in this section that we're going to look at now, is attempting to prepare us to think rightly about suffering as well so that we can accomplish his mission for our life. So I want to read that for us. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Peter says, since therefore Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. There it is. See that thinking word? Arm yourself with the same way of thinking about suffering. Why? For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way that people are, they might live in the spirit the way that God does. Here's our big idea this morning, that Christ-like suffering flows from Christ-like thinking. Christ-like suffering flows from Christ-like thinking. I hope you saw that in verse number 1. Peter's talking about this idea of thinking, and if we're going to endure suffering, if we're going to persevere through suffering, we have to think about it the way that Christ wants us to think about it. Actually think about it in the ways that Christ thought about that. That's an amazing thought, isn't it? Isn't it an amazing thought that he says that Christ had a way of thinking about suffering? And he says that we are to grab a hold of that in the same way that he thought about it. He says, actually goes beyond, he says we are to arm ourselves with that. To arm ourselves with that. When I think of arm yourself, what images it conjures up inside of your mind? Like, it is the idea of getting prepared and equipped for a battle. Right? It's the idea of getting the right weapons in your pockets, is getting the right tools for yourself, preparing your mind and getting equipped. It's this battle kind of a language. And why would he say that? Because suffering is a battle in a sense. It is a battle in what sense? It is a battle for the perseverance of your faith. Like, am I going to persevere through this? Am I going to press in through this? Or when suffering comes, am I going to cave in? Like the parable of the soils. When difficulty comes, do I shrink away or do I keep bearing fruit? Like, which one am I going to be? You ever notice that Jesus talked about suffering all the time? In his ministries and in the Gospels, he taught about it all the time. And he actually comes to one place in Luke 9:44 where he tells the disciples, he's been trying to tell them about suffering that's going to come for himself. And he says this statement, he said, let it sink into your ears. Like, get it into your mind that I'm going to suffer. Like, you got to grab a hold of that. If you're going to follow me, you are as well. He's not mincing words. He tells them as well, you're going to suffer too. And he tells them for these things. And so as Jesus discipled Peter, you think about now what Peter is going to disciple these believers here. We're not surprised he's going to talk about this. And he's trying to disciple you and me as well in this so that we might think the same thoughts that Jesus had about suffering, that we might be prepared. Because if we're called to suffer, and if we're going to suffer like Christ did, right, and glorify God in the midst of that, and be proclaimers of that in the midst of that, then we have to think the way that Jesus thought. You say, well, how did Jesus think? Well, I'm going to give you 3 thoughts about that, 3 thoughts from the passage, and I want you to notice that there's 3 times the word for is mentioned in the passage, and that's going to be our outline. Notice it says in verse number 1, for whoever suffered. That's going to be our first one. And then verse number 3 says, for the time has passed. That should be number 2. And then down in verse number 6, for this is why. So 3 times the word for is mentioned. We're going to use those as our hooks, as our outline today. So 3 thoughts about suffering. Here's the first one. Suffering has a way of revealing my identity. Suffering has a way of revealing my identity. Look at verse 1. He says, therefore, Christ suffered in the flesh. Arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For, here it is, whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, that maybe some alarm bells are going off in your mind about, wait, did I just read that the correct way? Did Peter just say, if you suffer, that you will cease from sin? Like, what does that mean? That's actually a phrase that's caused a lot of confusion for believers in the past. What does he mean by that? Well, let's say what he doesn't mean. Peter is not saying that if we suffer, if we go through a bout of suffering, that we get to the place where we stop sinning. Now, that's true just experientially in your life and in my life. I think we know that. It's true in Peter's life. I think Peter suffered with Jesus. All right, he suffered in the book of Acts, for the name of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later in a few minutes. But he suffered in Acts 5 and other places. And yet, you fast forward into Acts 10, he's dealing with Cornelius. He's still sinning. Like in Acts chapter 10, he's got a problem with racism. Like he doesn't want Gentiles mixing with the Jews. He's not really happy about Cornelius coming to know the Lord. And other times where Paul had to get onto him and confront him face to face because he was in error. He was wrong. And so to think that just because Peter is the one writing this, and he himself knows that just because I suffered in the flesh, just because I went through a battle and proclaiming Jesus Christ does not mean in my own personal life that I stop sinning. How about this, just for confirmation? 1 John 1:8 says, if we say that we have no sin, like if we say we don't have any sin, like I'm just doing right and everything's great with me and I've got nothing to confess to anybody, nothing to confess unto the Lord. He says, if you say that, then we are deceived. Like we have totally missed it. Like we were totally off base. So we know that we're going to battle with sin until we go home to be with Jesus. And so he's not saying that somehow if you suffer for him, that you're going to get to some spiritual high where you don't sin anymore. All right, so if that's not what he means, then what does he mean, right? What does he mean? I think he means that there is a break with sin in our lives. I think he's talking about a break with sin. I want to explain this the best that I can, and you just stick with me here on this, okay? All right, so think about Jesus. So he's comparing this with Jesus. Christ suffered for sin, and so that we also arm ourselves with the same one. And so what does that mean with that? Well, Jesus suffered in the flesh for sin, not his own sin, but for our sin. Jesus had no sin to suffer for, but he did suffer for our sin. Our sin was placed upon Jesus Christ. The wrath of God was placed upon Jesus Christ so that we might have our sins forgiven and taken away. And when that happened, remember what Peter said last week? That was a once and for all dealing with sin. And after that took place, there was a break from him from sin, no longer to deal with that. Like the power of sin that he dealt with is all over and gone. He's made a once and for all sacrifice and a clear break with that. Praise God. All right, well, for the believer, though, I think he's saying that Peter is saying that those who follow Jesus Christ in a different way, but a similar thought concept here, in a similar way, those who follow Jesus Christ also make a break with sin. To follow Jesus Christ is to make a break with sin. And listen, suffering proves that the break has been made in our life. I think the next phrase really helps well. Notice the next phrase. See if you can see that now. He says, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, got that, so as to live for the rest of their life of the time in the flesh, no longer for your human passions, but for the will of God. See the break and the contrast there between how I used to live this way, but no longer I'm now living this way. Now there's been a clear break with sin. That's it right there. So I'm still struggling with that. Ricky, can you help me out with that? When I was in high school, I played on the football team, and I was a wide receiver for the Bradford Tornadoes. And we were not a powerhouse, but I enjoyed playing with them. And I wasn't the biggest guy on the team. All right, I was tall, but I was lanky. And when I was in ninth grade, I think I weighed 125 pounds, me soaking wet. I mean, there was just not much of me. I had not played really much football since like Little League. I really didn't enjoy getting hit that much, so I'm going away from that. I'm playing flag or baseball or something like that. But I love football so much, love watching it. By the time I got to high school, I wanted to play. But now here I was, this tiny little toothpick of a guy out there running around with all these pads on. The pads probably weighed more than I did. And you probably looked at that guy and said, how in the world is he ever going to survive? And I wonder if my parents kind of secretly hoped that if I just got one good hit on me, I just got my bell rung one time, maybe I'd quit. And I remember one time that actually took place, and we were playing a game on a Friday night, and our quarterback was throwing the pass, and he was throwing it, and he didn't throw it to me. He actually threw it to the other team. That's called an interception. And so I hate to use sports analogies in case you don't know much about that, but I think you can follow this one along. But he throws an interception to the other team. And so now my job is no longer to catch the pass and run for a touchdown. My job is now to catch the other guy who's going to try to score a touchdown for the other team, right? So I'm running after this guy, and I'm chasing him down, and I've got my eyes set dead on him, and I'm looking to lay a lick on him. And as I'm running over, he has a teammate who is running from the opposite direction that I cannot see. And I'm telling you, he comes, and I got my helmet here, right? So he's looking, and he hits me, and he blindsides me, and I'm telling you, he just trucked me. I mean, he annihilated me. I mean, he just cleaned my clock, and there I am. I'm lying on the ground, and I am in agony. I mean, my bell is rung, and I am hurting, and it was the hardest hit I can possibly imagine in my life. And yet, I'll tell you, I've told this story many times. It's always been the same thought. I had one thought going through my head. One thought is that, Ricky, you get up off the ground right now before your mama comes onto the field and embarrasses the mess out of you. And so I was like, that's the only, I don't care how bad I was hurting, that's what I wanted to do. So I get up off the ground, and I'm kind of wobbling along, and I walk over to the sideline, and my coach says to me, "Welcome to football, Ricky. Well, welcome to football." And we had so much fun in the next couple of days going back and watching the film of that. So they recorded that, and my teammates ragged me so much as they played me getting hit, and then rewinded it and saw it again, and rewinded and saw it again. We had so much fun with that. But between what the coach said, "Ricky, welcome to football," and I got up off the ground, and I kept pressing in. I didn't quit. It proved to me that I was sticking with it. I was on the team. It also proved to my fellow teammates that I was on the team as well, that I wasn't going to go back to playing flag football. I wasn't going to go out for the golf team or whatever. Like I was with that. I had made a break from the things in the past. I was going to be on the team. Do you get that? So think about this for a second. Like, let me ask you, how do you know that you're saved? Like, how do you really know? Like, what can you look for as evidence that the new life that Jesus has died to give to you, he's implanted inside of you? Like, what evidence do you have? How do you know that you truly are his follower? How do you know that you've broke from sin? You made a clear break from your old way of life, as Peter mentions here, and now you're following after Jesus Christ. How do you know? Well, I think Peter is saying there's probably multiple ways you can answer that, but I think Peter is saying here one of the primary ways is how you relate to suffering. And what happens when you get hit? What happens when you get knocked down? What happens? Do you fall down? Do you stay on the ground? Do you quit the team? Or do you keep persevering with Jesus Christ? I think that's where he's going with this, because Christians are called to suffer. We saw that back in chapter 2, verse 21. We might put it on the screen for you. For to this you have been called. Like to what? To suffering, because Christ also suffered for you. And if we suffer and we persevere, listen, it's evidence that we are truly his followers. Because in our old days, as Peter's saying, in our old days, we loved our sin. We lived in the passions of our sinful life, and we liked our sin. We fed our sin. We nourished our sin. We indulged ourselves. But now, we've said we're a Christian now. We're following Jesus Christ. And so how do I know? Well, now I no longer care about those things. They don't have the same power over me. They're not my identity. Now, I love Jesus Christ so much, I'm even willing to suffer for Jesus Christ, if that's what he calls me to do, if that's what he has lined up for me. And that's proof that I've made a break. I'm not the same guy. I'm not the same guy. Peter knew about this. I said earlier in Acts chapter 5, Peter, remember, he's suffering with some of the other disciples, and they suffer for Jesus. They're beaten. They're put in prison. Now what are they going to do? Are they going to quit and go home? Go back to fishing? And it says there in Acts chapter 5, they rejoiced for being counted worthy to suffer like Jesus. And here's this line. It says they kept preaching Jesus Christ. They kept going in the will of God. They kept going. They got hit and kept going. Huge. And that's a huge thing to grab hold of our identity of who we are, is suffering, how it reveals that. It burns the things away that need to go away. And the things that matter rise into the top. And Jesus Christ matters the most. And listen, right now, I know some of you are in suffering in some way. You're on the spectrum there. You could be in a difficult season of ministry. And man, if you're a small group leader, I know it's been difficult. It's been challenging in these days. Some of you are having hard conversations with family over Jesus because you're trying to do as Peter's called us to, or how you're being treated at work, or how you're being maligned there because they know you follow the Lord. Or some of you are just waiting for prayers to be answered. You've been praying for a long time and you're just weighing up underneath all that. You say, God, where are you at? And what's taking place here? This is not how I thought I was going to go. And say, what does God say to me? I think part of what he was saying from 1 Peter is to persevere, to keep going, that he sees you, he loves you, and he's using these things in your life as you persevere to confirm in your own heart and mind that you really are his, because you don't quit when things go bad. And you're also confirming to others that this is a true follower of Jesus Christ, and that the things that he used to live for are no longer what he used to live for. What he matters most now is to be a godly man or a godly woman or a godly student at school or teenager. And so you have to ask ourselves a question like, what is your response right now to suffering saying about you? Saying about you? Is it revealing your identity, the break from sin that you say you have? That I say that I have. Suffering has a way of doing that. Number 2 is this, though. That's another thought. What's another thought? How about this? Suffering has a way of changing my perspective. Suffering has a way of changing my perspective. You say, what kind of perspective? I think Peter is talking about a perspective on how we use our time, what really matters in this life. Do you see that there? He says, so as to live the rest of our time in the flesh, no longer for this, but for this. Verse 3, for the time that is past is suffice. He's bringing our attention about our time now, what we spend it on. Have you ever noticed that suffering has a way of revealing perspective, what really matters in our life? The things, when you go through suffering, the things that you used to think were a really big deal, the things that you used to think were really worth living for no longer seem to be that way anymore. Like, am I the only one who thinks that, or do you get what I'm saying with that? I compare suffering like going on a mission trip. You go on a mission trip, you can't come back the same. Especially go to a third world country. You go somewhere and it's hard to come back into regular civilian life, so to speak, because of what you've seen, what you've experienced. And people come back and it's hard to go back and think about money the same way and possessions and what we have, because you've seen so much. You've experienced something that's forever changed you. Sometimes it may not even be something you experience. Sometimes just being near somebody who suffers, like spending time around people who are going through suffering, that changes our perspective. I remember sitting in a seminary class one day when a fellow student of mine brought a friend to class, and that wasn't that unusual. And so anytime a friend would come in, a guest, the professor would allow the student to stand up and introduce their friend, and he could stand up and then tell about himself and what God's doing in his life. And I remember this one time when this happened, so this guy stands up, and it was a pretty normal, routine day until he began to speak. And he said that he was a pastor, he was a missionary, and he was going back home, or he's going to North Korea, of all places. Like North Korea, I mean, this was back in like 2006, 2007, so you know about this, and you think, and all of a sudden that got our attention really fast. Because we were all there. We're preparing for ministry. We're preparing for gospel ministry and dreaming about where we might go. And here is this guy. And he's telling us about where he's going to go, North Korea of all places. And I'm telling you, as we heard him talk and we began to anticipate where he was going and what ministry God had for him outlined and where he was going to go and the difficulty that was going on to be there. I'm telling you that the debates that we were having about that minute of things of doctrine, I'm telling you that seemed right then like a colossal waste of time. Like those things that we were debating about just didn't have the same weight anymore. Like all of a sudden right there, we just thought that this guy was living for something more. This is what really matters. That guy had done a personal evaluation for himself that he was willing to enter into that suffering, and it forced all of us to think about the same thing as well. Like all of a sudden, like right then, that moment, something was changing inside of our hearts. You ever experienced something like that before? Where you're around somebody, you're entering into something, and you just can't be the same? Sometimes funerals are like that, right? You go to a funeral, and all of a sudden, the things that you used to think were really important, when you're listening to that guy speak at the front, and you're seeing the body that's in the coffin, you're seeing the hurt that's on the family, you're seeing what he spent his time on and what he wished he would have spent his time on. All of a sudden, you start doing personal evaluation, and suffering and difficulty rises to things that really matter to the top, and the things that don't got to go away, and you walk out of there differently. Like that, Peter is talking about that here. He's using that. He's saying this is what it's supposed to do. He says, look what he says, we're no longer to live for the things we used to live for. And we're not to spend our time in the flesh no longer for those human things. And look what he says, verse 3. He says, the time is past. It is suffice for what you used to spend your time on. Let the suffering do its work in your life to raise up to the top what matters, your priorities. Let them flow all the way to grab a hold of those. Let the other things that go away, let it do that purifying work of your perspective on life. He says it's enough time to do what the Gentiles do. That's just sinful lifestyle. Sinful lifestyle. What's he saying? He says you spent enough time. You spend enough time living for yourself and living for sin and avoiding suffering at all costs and indulging yourself. And now you're a follower of Jesus Christ. More than enough time. We've all could say that, can't we? Before Jesus Christ, we spent more than enough time. Oh, that I could go back and turn away from that so much sooner to spend my time now on what really matters. Like now is the time to spend our time for the rest of our days for the will of God. And I don't know how much time you have left. And I don't know how much time that I have left, but let the suffering that we are enduring and the suffering that we see around us clarify for us of what really should be most used of our time. Now, don't allow, the contrast would be, do not allow your losing experiences to cause you to shrink back, but rather each of us has to do a personal evaluation of where we are, where we've come from, what God has done to save us, and where we are going, and how we're going to live for Him in the middle of the suffering. Jesus thought about this, right? Jesus, He lived with a singular purpose. He lived through suffering, but He never wavered on the mission. Not one time did He lose perspective. He thought about the entire time. It says He set His eyes and His heart like flint towards Jerusalem. He knew what He was coming, and nothing was going to move Him away from that. He came for that. He said, I've come to seek and to save the lost. He says, I'm going to suffer and you're going to suffer. But he says, if you suffer, if you come and you follow me, there's going to be a reward. And he tells his disciples, you're never going to go back to fishing anymore. You've got something greater to listen to follow after. Let everything else fall away. Let suffering bring in what really matters. You've got a new mission you're going to spend your life on. That is for the Lord. And suffering comes and just reminds us of what really matters in that. He says, we spent enough time on the things in the past. We're going to use the rest of our days, even the suffering days, for Jesus Christ. And he gives this long list here, right? This list of things they used to spend their time on. And I think these were well-known things that the people in Peter's audience would have known about. And I think Peter knows that. And he's saying everybody in the audience there can say, yep, spend enough time on those. Yep, this rung the bell with them. This resonated with them. And I think we can resonate with us as well. Look what he says. He says, this is the stuff you spend your time on. It used to be this stuff, what? Sensuality. All right, and he talks about orgies. I'm not going to define those things for us, but he's like sexual sin. Like, can we not all say that before Christ, or even maybe sometimes after Christ, but that is stealing enough of our life and focus? Like the shame and the guilt that comes along with that. I've spent enough days walking in that. I don't want it did nothing good for me to hide in the dark and to indulge. Like, there's nothing good there. How about passions? Like, what are the passions, the things that we live for? I'm sure they had their passions. We have our passions that we struggle with. I've spent enough time living for success, right? When you go to a funeral, you begin to think, I've spent enough time. I need to change course now. Living for respect or living for entertainment and pleasure and video games. Like, I've spent enough time. I look back at my time that I spent doing some of those things, like it's done. I don't have time for that anymore. It's not that they're bad, but like I got a higher purpose to live for. What about beauty? Right, we just spend our time, ladies, or we spend our time looking for that and keeping the right body. I spend enough time on that. About drinking, right? He says drinking multiple times, drunkenness, drinking parties. That doesn't do us any good. Spend enough time staring at the bottom of a bottle and the addictions that it brought to my life, the enslavement that came with that, the hurt that it did in my family, the hurt that it did in my parents' family or my grandparents' family. I spent enough time back there, no more. Lawlessness, living for me has never gotten me anywhere good. It's enough time with that. We're to think like Christ, who had a singular purpose to accomplish the Father's will. And he says we're to do the same thing. I'm not going back to where I used to be. I've spent enough time with that. It's got nothing on me. It's got nothing for me. I've got a higher life and a higher priority. And now it's a huge perspective shift. So you have to ask, where are you losing right now? We've used that term a lot. Like, where are you losing right now? And are you allowing it to remind you of what truly matters in life? If I could use a really quick example, it's not so much suffering, but it's in the ballpark here. It's just the pandemic that we've been going through, all right? We're not suffering for that because we did something that we're suffering for Christ. Everybody's facing this, but it's an example for us. Like, I hope right now, all of a sudden, things that we used to take for granted are now like rising to the top. Like, the most important things now are for us, all of a sudden, relationships, church relationships matter more. And when we used to take them for granted, take them lightly before, but no longer. And when prayer matters now, things are rising to the top. Getting the gospel to others matter because we think the time is short and our life is in peril. Eternity matters and family matters. And so all of these things. So we have to ask ourselves, that we've gone through that for the last couple of months. Has it changed our perspective? And when we get back together next week, are we going to see that? Are we going to see that this really matters so much? And we're going to spend our time on those things? We're going to move ahead as a disciple-making church? Or because we realize it can be taken away so quickly? It could be gone. We've experienced that, and we've gone through that, and God has brought perspective to us, and now we're moving ahead. We're grabbing hold of what matters. All right, suffering has a way of clarifying my hope. This is our third one. Suffering has a way of clarifying my hope. This is that third way of thinking. All right, we're preparing our minds about suffering. We're thinking about it the right way. It's changed our perspective, right? And so now it needs to think about, we change our way we hope. Look what Peter says. He says, if you live that way, if you spend your time on what really matters, he says, you're going to be maligned. You see that there? He says, with respect to this, verse 4, they are surprised. They're shocked when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. The language there is so strong, powerful, of the flood of sin, the crashing down, the running towards, the streaming towards sin. He says, you're not doing that anymore. And what do? They malign you. I don't think that's a news flash for us. People are going to tear you up they're going to be surprised that you used to do one thing in a way and live one way, and now you're not. And they may do this to your face. They may say some derogatory things towards you. Or they're going to tear you up over dinner at night. You're not even there. They're going to talk you and take your character and take your life and who you are and just tear you to pieces. They may do it in the break room and you overhear that of what they're talking about with you there. All because you don't do what you used to do. All because you don't do what they do. You're not going out and getting drunk with them any longer. You're not getting off work and going to the strip bars any longer. You don't jump in with them and dog your spouse like you used to. You don't talk bad about your husband like you used to do. You don't gossip about them like you used to do. Like, you don't do the things you used them to do. And so they turn on you. They malign you. And man, that hurt is so real. I can prepare you for it and talk about it, but the hurt is going to be real when it happens. But here's our hope. Suffering brings our hope to the forefront. Look what this. He says this, but they will give an account, verse 5, to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. You don't have to worry if they were going to answer for what they do. They will. God has promised that. God will sort it out with perfect justice. Everything that's broken, everything that's been done, he will sort those things out. And so we're not living right now for the scoreboard here on earth. We're not trying to win for the wins here. We're trying to win the scoreboards in heaven, and it'll all be sorted out in the numbers we put into place when we get to heaven one day. It's in one day. Like, the scoreboard's invisible right now, and it looks like we're losing, but one day God's going to reveal, and he's going to give us our reward. You say, did Christ think about it like this? Sure he did. Can I tell you to go back to chapter number 2? Where Jesus was being reviled. Remember that? In chapter 2, he's being reviled, but he did not revile in turn. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He did not come back at them. Why? Notice what he says. He continued to entrust himself to him who judges justly. He had a perspective about suffering. He had a perspective about the malignment which he endured his whole ministry, and even the one that was there at the very end. right? Peter is telling us to arm ourselves, equip yourself with the same. That's what's going to push you through of looking ahead. This is where my hope is. God will judge. God will take care of these things, and we can proclaim the gospel in the midst of that. And so he says in verse 5 that they're going to give an account for that. And then in verse 6, all right, there's our third for this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead. He's talking about those who were alive, that had the gospel proclaimed to them, and now they have died. But he says that though they are judged in the flesh, the way that people are, all right, so we know that the wages of sin is death. We die physically once. All right, Jesus died in the flesh, but they might live in the spirit the way that Christ does. For the believer who has put their faith in Jesus Christ, they have spiritual life given to them. And just like Jesus went into the heavens and he lives with the Father, so that we have spiritual life as well. For those who have heard the gospel, responded to it, died, they have spiritual life. They're with the Father in heaven where they are. I think what was happening, one of the things there is the opponents. The people who are maligning them, remember that's the kind of theme here. They were saying, like, what good is your hope in Jesus? Like, what good is your hope in Jesus? Your friend, you had a friend that was going to church with you over there. He trusted in Jesus and he died. What good is it for him? Like, what good is it for you? Like, we're all going to the same place. We're going to die. And so why not live it up with us? Well, you are missing out on so much. You're missing out on so much fun and so many parties, and you can't see any hope. You can't see any change. You can't see it, and you're missing out, and everything. You're going to die the same way that guy did. And why not live your life differently? Why not live it right now for all things that we are? Come on, let's go get drunk. Let's go out in the town. Let's have some fun. Let's go do our thing. And today we live, and tomorrow we die. Who cares? And what's Peter saying? Yes, they died. But it wasn't for the end for them, because they lived for what matters most. They persevered in their walk with Jesus Christ, and now they're alive with God. He says now they are victorious. They live where God does, and how God does, they're with Him. So just as Jesus was maligned at the cross by His enemies, but made alive and now reigns with God. We saw that last week, right? He's seated at the right hand of God, he says in chapter number 3. So too will we be there as well. The scoreboard is in heaven. We're living for there, not on earth. So can I tell you, brothers and sisters, listen to me. When you take your very first breath in heaven, can you picture that for a second? You close your eyes on this earth, and you open your eyes. You take your first look around, and you breathe that heavenly celestial air, and it fills your lungs, and you take that first breath. Can I tell you what's going to happen? You are not going to regret one moment of the suffering you had for Jesus Christ. You're not. You're not going to regret the decisions that you made to live for the will of God, like Peter's talking about here. You won't regret the choices that you made of how you spent your time. You're not going to regret getting up early on a Sunday morning and setting up and tearing down so that people can enjoy a church and to be together and hear the word proclaimed and make disciples. You're not going to regret any time you lost. If you lost 30 minutes of watching the Bills game doing that, you're not going to regret that. Listen, you're not going to regret the money you spent investing in the kingdom of God so that people could have their eternity transformed and changed. You're never going to look back and wish that you had spent more money on a better vacation or a better retirement. You're just not. And so allow the suffering to put your eyes and your hope and tie it to heaven. You let suffering change where your hope is found, and so you don't forget and live as though this life is all that there is. What they were maligning them about. What good is it to live for Jesus Christ? What good is it? They said, what good is it? It's because we're not living for this world. The scoreboard is in heaven. Is where we're going. You're not going to regret the time you spent leading a small group and making disciples when you could have been coasting. You're not going to regret the time you spent standing firm and not compromising your faith when everyone else's school is giving in. And you're not, and you're ostracized by that. You're not going to regret that when you take your first breath in heaven. You're not going to regret the faith that you lived and you walked in when everything around you was so dark, you didn't know what God was doing and where He was leading you. You're not going to regret that. The reward is going to be great. You're not going to regret the time that you spent in prayer, fervent prayer for your friends or your family or people that you know. You're not. Why? Because Jesus didn't. Jesus didn't. It says in Hebrews 12. I'll put it up on the screen. It says in Hebrews 12 how Jesus thought about suffering. And part of his suffering when he was going through it, as he was preparing for it, was that he looked for heaven. He looked beyond this world. It says, for the joy set before him, the joy of the eternal reward of the forgiveness that would come to our account. It said that he endured the cross. He despised the shame, but now he's seated at the right hand of God. So there it is. There's that place where he's going is where we're going. And it says in the next verse, he says, therefore, don't grow weary or don't become faint-hearted in your struggle. As Jesus lived this way, as he thought about suffering, you think about suffering as well. Harvest, I'm telling you, there's joy set before us. And let it cause us to think about that, suffering differently, and endure suffering now, and long for the reward that is to come. Live for there. Let the suffering that we endure cause us to long for heaven that we're going to live the way that God does with God in heaven one day. That's how we're to think about suffering. I know we've been talking about that a lot, but Peter's preparing our minds. Are you prepared? All right, is your hope in the right place? Right, is your perspective in the right place? Right, is your identity in Jesus Christ? Because if you don't know Jesus Christ, you have no hope of heaven. And listen, if you don't know Jesus Christ, now is the time to give your life over to him so you can have this hope and stop living for the things. Haven't you spent enough time in the things of this world? And you might break from those things and say, hey, that's not gotten me anywhere good. My thing's not working. I'm turning away from that. I see who Jesus is, and I want to follow Jesus Christ. I know who he is. I'm going to follow him. Jesus changed me, changed my mission and my agenda to cause me to live for you now. Listen, if that's you, we want to know. We want to help you and encourage you to live like Peter's talking about here. Would you email us, or would you say something in the comment section on social media? But now is the time. What would stop you? What would keep you right now from giving a hope like this when you think about what Peter is telling us here? What would keep you? Put your faith in Jesus Christ. I want to pray for you right now that God would give you the grace and the enablement to do that even right now. God, I pray, Lord, for those who are listening who do not know you. Maybe they think they know you, or they thought they know you, but now they realize they don't. That they have not made a break from sin. They have not turned away from those things and put their faith in you. And God, I pray that you would keep nothing. You would move everything out of the way that would keep them in their thoughts and their minds from putting right now their faith in you and Jesus Christ. And it will give them the boldness and the courage to reach out and say, I'm following Jesus Christ now. I'm breaking. I want to join the team of Jesus Christ. And I'm not going back. And Lord, you would surround them with a family. You would surround them with this church right here to help them to grow in that. But God, I want to pray for my brothers and sisters, Lord, who just like me, we have feet of clay. And God, we struggle with these things. And one day we can have the perspective is right. And the next day it's gone. And God, one day we think rightly about suffering. And then a couple moments later, we've lost it again. And God, I pray that, Lord, a clarifying, burning away would come right now where we thought about things in the past, how we came to this message, we changed. And God, we would see things and think about things the way that you do, so that we might suffer and persevere the way that you do. Because you say if we suffer for Jesus Christ and we persevere, if we wear the cross now, the crown was coming and waiting for us in heaven. Oh, Lord, put our hearts and our minds and our treasures and our hope all in heaven, all in you, all in Jesus Christ, all in the gospel. God, would you help us with that? And God, I praise you for this time in your word. Thank you for teaching us. And God, now help us to live it, to not be hearers of the word, but doers of it. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.